In this video, we first look at how do you know when you've got a trigonometry question, and then we start to look at how to label sides, and then after that, we start to look at sine, cos, and tan, or SOHCAHTOA. And finally, we start to look at the first steps in solving trigonometry questions. We won't get to the final answer, but it's the first steps. So let's get going on the first part. So how do you know when you have a trigonometry question? Well, firstly, you have a right angle triangle, which shown in here in green is a little square in the corner of one of the angles. And that little square is showing that the angle is 90 degrees. So that's the first point. The second point is that you have two knowns, and I've labelled them, I've highlighted them as the two yellow highlights. Sometimes it can be an angle and a side, as in 30 degrees as the angle, and 4, which would be 4 centimetres or 4 metres, as the length of a side. So that's the first situation, an angle and a side. Or another situation where your two knowns are the length of two sides. In this case, 14.9, for example, centimetres, and 38 centimetres. So we've got two knowns and one unknown for a right angled triangle. And the unknowns, if it's the length of a side, it will be a letter, a pronumeral. Okay? Sometimes it's A. Other times it can be an E or an F or a U. Okay, so it's a pronumeral. So this is for the lengths of a side. And if it's an angle, normally we have an unknown angle as theta. So that looks like a circle or an oval with a little line through it. So theta. So main point here is we've got two knowns and one unknown for a right angle triangle, trigonometry. Okay, when you get a trigonometry question, the first step that you need to do is you need to start to label the sides. And we will label the first side as hypotenuse. Okay, so we're going to do that first. So a hypotenuse is actually the longest side in a triangle. And you can see that it's directly opposite from, or directly across from, the right angle. And so I've got the red arrows there showing that it's straight across from the right angle. So that's the hypotenuse. So in number 1, it's 4 centimetres. Number 2, we're not given the length of the hypotenuse, but you still label it. Number 3, it's 35. Number 4, it's A, and so on. So that's our first step in solving a trigonometry question. We label the sides and we actually label the hypotenuse. Next, after we've labelled the hypotenuse, we need to label the side that's adjacent to the angle. And so the side next to or adjacent to the angle in question 1 is, I've labelled it ADJ, adjacent, shown with the little red arrow there. Number 2, ADJ is 7. Okay. Number 3, ADJ is A. So it's really, really important for you to label the hypotenuse first and then the adjacent. And the reason is you can easily identify the hypotenuse because it's straight across from the little right angle square. Okay, don't want to mess up the labelling of hypotenuse and adjacent. So always hypotenuse first, then adjacent, and then after that you label opposite. And so the opposite side is the side that's actually opposite the angle. So you can see with the little red arrow there in number 1, A, okay, the side A is opposite 30 degrees, okay. Number 2, the side A is again opposite 30 degrees. And number 3, it's not labelled with a length or a letter, a pronumeral, but you can see that the one opposite 17 degrees is labelled. And also for 4, you can see that sort of the triangles are, you can see that number 4, it's actually twisted around, but it doesn't matter that it's twisted around. You still look for the hypotenuse, and then the adjacent, and then the opposite, and so you can find the opposite after you've labelled hypotenuse and adjacent. So really this is the first step in solving trigonometry questions, is labelling sides. First hypotenuse, then adjacent, and then after that opposite. Okay, once you've labelled sides, we move on to our second step in solving trigonometry questions, and that is knowing about something called SOHCAHTOA. So it's the SO, Ka, and TOA, SOHCAHTOA. And that's a kind of an acronym for SO is when you've got sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse, or cos theta equals adjacent over hypotenuse, and tan theta equals opposite over adjacent. I've just color coded there that we have our opposites in orange, hypotenuse in green, and adjacent I've color coded in purple, just to show where those letters come from. Okay, and so OPP will be opposite, HYP will be hypotenuse, and ADJ is adjacent. So our second step is determining which formula to use, and so we need to be able to look at a triangle to determine which formula to use. So let's go to number 1. So we've done our first step. We've labelled the hypotenuse as 4. We've labelled adjacent, and we've labelled opposite. And I've colour-coded here in this one that the 2 knowns are yellow and the 1 unknown is pink. And so what we can see is with the lengths of the sides, we've got an opposite in pink and a hypotenuse in yellow. And so from our SOHCAHTOA, an opposite and a hypotenuse, which one will that be? Opposite and hypotenuse. That'll be So it'll be sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse. So what we do is we do sine 30, that's our 30 being the angle, equals opposite over hypotenuse, and that equals A over 4. Okay, so that's the first step in really starting to solve that one there. Okay, done. And our final answer will be A equals something, but we're not moving on to solving to that far in this video. In our next video, we will do that. Now, our second one, we have, remember the steps, we label the hypotenuse, we label the adjacent side, and we label the opposite side. We've determined that we've got 2 knowns, the yellow ones, and 1 unknown, which is the pink one. And so we're dealing with an opposite and an adjacent. So opposite and adjacent. So will that be sine, cos, or tan with opposite and adjacent? So SOHCAHTOA, opposite and adjacent. Which one are we dealing with? Opposite and adjacent. It's tan. So we're going to use the formula tan theta equals opposite over adjacent. So we have tan 30, so 30 degrees, equals opposite over adjacent. And so opposite is A and adjacent is 7. So we've got tan 30 equals A over 7. And again, we're midway through solving that question. We're just getting up to that step tan 30 equals a over 7. Again, in our next video, we will show how to follow through and solve for a equals something, a being the length of the side. Okay, let's do one more. Okay, so we've labelled the lengths of the sides. So we've got firstly the hypotenuse, that's labelled. Secondly, adjacent, we've labelled that. And thirdly, opposite, we've labelled that. And we've highlighted that we've got an adjacent and a hypotenuse. And so with an adjacent and a hypotenuse, we need to now determine if we're using sine, cos, or tan. So let's go up here for adjacent and hypotenuse. Okay, well, it's not sine because that's opposite and hypotenuse. Could it be cos, adjacent and hypotenuse? Absolutely it is. So cos theta equals adjacent over hypotenuse. That's the formula that we're going to be using. Okay. So we have cos 17, 17 being the angle, equals adjacent over hypotenuse. And so adjacent is A, and the hypotenuse is 35. And so up to that step, we have cos 17 equals A divided by 35. Okay, so in the three situations that we've had, we have had an angle that we've known, okay, 30 degrees, or 17 degrees, and we've had one length of a side that we know and one that we don't know. Okay. In our final example, which will be question 8, what we've got on that one is slightly different because it's the angle that's unknown. Okay, we still follow through the same steps, and those steps being, firstly, we label the hypotenuse, okay, 38, so it's labelled as hypotenuse. Then the length of the side, or the side that is adjacent or next to the angle, we label it as adjacent. And then thirdly, the side that's opposite the angle, we label as OPP, opposite. So that's the one that is 14.9, for example, centimetres. And we've got an opposite and a hypotenuse, okay, that are labelled. And so with opposite and hypotenuse, again, we go back up to our sine, cos, tan. And opposite and hypotenuse, we can see that that will be sine. So we've got sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse. So let's go down and go through the steps for that one. So sine theta equals opposite over hypotenuse. And so the opposite is 14.9 and the hypotenuse is 38. And so now we're at the stage of, we're about halfway through solving for each of those questions. In our next video, we will follow through and we'll get an answer for all of them. So just to recap, that with trigonometry, how do you know when you've got trigonometry? Well, you have a right angled triangle, shown in green. You'll have two knowns, shown in yellow, and one unknown, shown in pink. Okay, and then after that, we label, firstly, the hypotenuse, secondly, the adjacent side, finally, the opposite side. So you label. After you've labelled, then you need to determine which kind of trigonometric ratio that you're dealing with, and then you start to solve. Okay. Thanks for watching the video, and good luck with your maths.